Hey gang, what is up? In this video, I show you the most complicated way to make a magnetic chisel holder. I mean, it's true, you could take a solid piece of wood and hog out a spot for the chisels and for the magnets and be done pretty quickly. But I like experimenting, and here I'm using some veneer on my veneer sled. I have two of these, a small one and a larger one, and I can cut perfect seams and use up all those small scraps. Now, another benefit of using veneer is I can size the thickness, if that makes sense. This is 1/16 thick veneer, about 1.5 millimeters, and I can see how strong the magnet is through that thickness of veneer. This seemed to be about right. Nothing too tricky here. I'm just going to pull these two pieces of veneer together. Pretty typical for joining shop sawn veneer or even commercial veneer, right? And those tabs make it a lot easier to remove that tape later. And here's a little trick I learned from my buddy Darren Oates out of Australia. You sand the face of the veneer, and that sandpaper will get rid of the glue and fill any discrepancies. Not that I had any. I like using a metal roller to ensure that the two veneers are flush to each other, and then always use a low raking light just to double check. The place that I'm going to attach this little box on my wall, I don't have a lot of space, so I wanted to make sure I had careful layout. I'm adding about a ½ inch between the handles. I typically grab the chisels by the neck or bolster, so this should give me plenty of space to grab the chisels. After I had that figured out, I decided that about a 32nd of an inch was enough slack for each particular blade. They're all different sizes, so kind of a custom thing. And I don't know if you noticed, but yeah, my chisels are sharp. I cut my thumb. Where I've had these stored for years, for the last 20 years, they were on a magnetic strip, and occasionally the magnet would catch the blade just right and it would drag it off the blade, and I don't think it was very good for the sharpness of my chisels. So yeah, after 20 years I decided to make a better chisel holder. And these bar magnets, I've had them for years. I got them off of Amazon. I believe they're Chinese made. They're pretty poor quality. They're not consistent in size. They're about 4 inches long, 100 millimeters, but they're really brittle, not super strong magnetically, and they crack, they chip, they explode. So I thought I would enclose them in something like this and find a good use for them. So I just needed some thin strips to make up the difference for the thickness of the magnets, and this worked really well. Love having a drum sander to sneak up on those perfect fits. So I hear from a lot of woodworkers that some of the work they find tedious and boring. Personally, I love figuring out situations like this, and I find a lot of solace working in the shop, creating, especially when I know I'm going to be making something that's going to be useful, right? Yeah, years ago I used to play drums, so here I'm practicing some triplets and paradiddles. Kidding. So initially I wasn't too sure how the thin strips of wood and the 1/4 inch plywood would glue up, but it turned out great. Everything was glued up and ready to trim, to true up, I guess. And so here I'm using my David Bedrosian Fritz and Franz jig. I love this thing. Super accurate, very easy to use, and extremely well thought out, and very well made. I'll leave a link to his Instagram account in the description. And one of these days, I'll either make some clamps or get some clamps that have the spring clamps with the rubber, like a rubber band, for holding on edges like this. I think they would be ideal. But blue tape will work here as well. And occasionally I'm that guy that wears a belt and suspenders, so I added a cowl and some clamps in addition to the blue tape, just to ensure that I had a good bond. I like this thin parts holder, I guess you'd call it, that I made, but I didn't really make it correct. It should incorporate the working dog on the tail vise so that it would move, not only to tighten but to release as well. At some point I'll modify it or make a new one. That's one aspect of woodworking that I absolutely love. And of course, a belt sander makes quick work of getting that veneer perfectly flush with the substrate. And here I'm using 100 grit to quickly accomplish that task. When I glued these, I scuffed the magnets just a bit, used a little epoxy underneath them, and then of course I used wood glue underneath the veneer. Alright, it is the next day and this thing came out fantastic. Grain match, not that it'll ever show, right? But it makes me happy. And the magnets are going to be strong enough to hold these larger chisels, so I know it'll work on the smaller ones as well. So I often wonder, what would my world look like without a belt sander? And here I'm using 180 grit, and this will be smooth enough to finish. I mean, I won't need to sand anything after that. And one more double check, triple check. Yeah, I like it. So these little pieces of walnut are the beginning of the pieces that will go between the chisels, and I'm putting a small chamfer or bevel in between them just to make insertion of the chisels a little bit easier, right? Super easy to do with a block plane. I often get asked what is the benefit of a unifence with the ability for it to lay down, like I have it here. When you're cutting small parts, sometimes the fence gets in the way, and so by laying it down, it gives you the necessary clearance so that your knuckles don't hit, or the push stick. I love the unifence. And one of these days I want to make a dedicated stop block that is incorporated into my workbench somehow, like a plane stop, with maybe removable or adjustable stops from thin to thinner for projects like this. As I started assembling this, I decided that the 1/32 slack for the chisel, or 0.8 millimeter, was a bit too much, so I just did it by feel, and that seemed to work best. I love little projects like this. I just move forward without any plans, no drawing, just kind of winging it. And after cutting the pieces to go between the chisels to size, because they were all different, testing the fit one more time, and everything tacked in place. Yeah, I believe that's going to work. Here I'm making the outside frame for the chisel holder. It's going to be like a shadow box of sorts. Here I'm using the fantastic Hedgehog featherboard, and instead of a dado, I just make a couple of passes. All right, so I'm working on this knife block, chisel block, kind of like a knife block, and it's going to get a border, this material, all the way around. Has this rabbet. This still needs cut to width, but essentially that would go there like that. And I kind of goofed. I was using this smaller chisel to lay everything out. And that would go like that, and this frame border would be here. I thought that'll work perfect, and I cut the height. Then I realized these wider chisels are longer, and that's just maxed out. So won't work. So I'm just going to add some Baltic birch strips, top and bottom. That'll give me the height I need, and this rabbet will still accommodate that strip that I add, and we'll be back in business. Yeah, things happen, right? So I'm making two of these, one for my marples chisels, and then another one for my Japanese chisels. And on this one, I plan on covering the whole back with veneer, and then this would go on here like that, and then these would go in place like that, and then I would put a border. But I realized that this thickness was slightly off, and so with this veneer, 16th veneer, I can raise the distance between the handle and the back by the thickness of the veneer by doing it like this. And then my border or frame is just going to have a rabbet that will sit directly on the plywood like that, right, all the way around. And then I can just cut a relief or a rabbet to accommodate this border. So yeah, things change, but it'll work. Case in point, maybe I should have made a drawing, yeah? But truthfully, that is where a lot of the fun in woodworking lies to me, is figuring out little problems as they come up, even if they're self-induced mistakes. Yeah, it all works out. You may already be aware of this, but anytime you have tape that has been bonded really well, maybe it was underneath a clamp or came out of the vacuum bag, or is just being stubborn, you can take a heat gun, soften the adhesive, and it should peel right off. Don't use too much heat or you can separate the glue and the adhesive will stay stuck to the wood. What? Belt sander again? What a surprise. So here I'm using a 180 grit belt to get rid of any mill marks from the joiner planer, and that'll be the finished sand for the inside of the frame. Here's a quick tip for you whenever you're cutting miters. This is the outside. You can see 145-degree angle there. I like cutting it this way. So I'm cutting, this is the inside. I can see my mark if I had one here. And this will be a perfectly clean cut because it's on the inside. The outside, since I'm cutting with the grain, it'll chip out maybe slightly. I mean, you can see it looks almost perfect, right? Tiny bit of chip out. However, once this is made, it's going to be a frame surrounding a box. Then I can either use a hand plane or a sander to clean up any of that little bit of chip out. It just makes a much cleaner cut. If I had this in place without this, what I call a zero clearance piece here, this would inevitably chip out cutting this way because I'm cutting into the grain. You can see the grain directions like this, and I'm hitting it with the blade. That would chip out. This way, at least I'm halfway with the grain since it's cutting at a 45-degree angle. So anyway, and I just keep on moving this piece over. So this is always fresh. And I cut both miters with the same 45-degree angle. I just flip the piece back and forth. If I have to use a shooting board, I will, but almost always I don't because of this setup. It makes for really clean, accurate miters. So I'm getting the border or the frame put on, and an easy way to do something like this is I just clamp one of them, this bottom one. I just clamp it in place with 2 little dots of glue. It'll come back off. The glue keeps it from moving around. I can hold it in place with a couple of clamps, and then I can just start fitting one at a time, go all the way around. I go and do something else, work on something else, come back, glue on another one, and you get perfect fits and no stress. Yeah, it works. Once the first chisel box came out of the clamps, I can hit all the sides with a 180 grit. I then use a block sander by hand to eliminate any small scratches left from the belt sander, and it'll be ready for finishing. So minimal sanding work. Well, I suppose that wasn't completely true. I still need to do the front edges, get rid of any glue, and make sure the miters are lined up perfectly flush. And yeah, I'm going to use a belt sander. Here I'm using 180 grit with just a light touch and keeping the sander moving so it doesn't dig in anywhere, but it'll get all those areas flush to each other. Then I can follow up with a block of wood and sand by hand to get everything nice and smooth, even, eliminate all the scratches from cross grain. Yeah, super easy, very fast, and I'll admit a little controversial. I found this large chisel at a yard sale one time when I picked up a bunch of pipe clamps, And I'll probably sharpen that one of these days when I actually need it. And I gotta tell you, I am super thrilled to have this project done. I've been wanting to do this for years. This will keep my chisels protected. Hanging them on a magnetic strip just wasn't the right solution. As they say, everything in its place, and a place for everything, right? And I only cut myself once. And this little dude on the left side, I just plowed some grooves for the magnets to hold these shop-made chisels and these corner chisels. Fantastic. Well, that's it for my unnecessarily complicated chisel box holder. I sincerely hope you got some use out of this video. As always, thank you tons for watching. I appreciate all the likes, comments, questions, and feedback. Thank you tons.